Yo, everybody. Welcome to Off Panel, a weekly interview podcast about all things comics, brought to you by Sketch.com. I'm your host, David Harper, and this week's guest is the artist of comics like The Six Sidekicks of Trigger Keaton and Mars Attacks, as well as the cartoonist of graphic novels like Roanoke, America's First Mystery, and the Krogan Adventure series. It's Chris Schweizer. Thanks for coming on, Chris.
Thank you so very much for having me, David. I appreciate it.
How's the day treating you so far?
Things are going pretty well. It's cooler than usual. I've got a portable window unit that I started bringing up a couple of years ago just because my studio gets pretty warm. And so I turn it off when I do interviews. And luckily today has been raining, so it is not in the mid to high 90s the way it has been. That's a treat. Just, pecking away at all the little things that add up to big things right now.
Are you currently in your studio?
I am currently in my studio, yeah.
I have to say, of all the people I've had on the podcast, I would say that you were probably the most likely one to have a knife visually available on the wall in the back of your studio. I don't imagine Scott Snyder has one hanging out back there, but I see one and I'm like, that makes sense, Chris.
I frequently take that down. I forget to do it when I have videos. My uncle brought it back for me when I was like 5 from a trip he took to the Philippines. And so I hang it up there. I'm not usually a weapons on the wall type of fella, but I that one means a lot to me, so I keep that one up there. But I used to carry it around in the woods all the time when I was a kid. I had a little belt. I'd just shove it in the side, and I'd leave it out. It got so coated with rust, and I realized as an adult that I could clean off said rust, and so now I keep it in relatively good shape. But
I know this is a complete aside, but I have to say it. I feel like I'm not the only person in the world who feels like this. In preparation for this, instead of reading Mars Attacks or Six Sidekicks of Trigger Keaton again, what did I read? I read Assassin Nation. And the funny thing is I feel like there's a small part of my brain in which Fuck Tarkington has actually become your identity. And the knife might make more sense for him, more so than you. But one way or another, it's blurred, and it just makes sense to me. I don't know why.
Well, Kyle, at one point when he was doing the back matter for that, was texting me questioning. He was like, "Hey, what's this?" He's like, "What's your favorite song? What's something?" And he's like, "That song doesn't work." And I was like, "What are you talking about?" He's like, "I'm writing up Tarkington's back matter, or like he's doing an interview as him." And I was like, "I'm not actually him, Kyle. You can't use my answers to get a good character thing." He's like, "What's your favorite Loretta Lynn song?" And I told him. He's like, "Okay, that'll be it." And I was like, "Okay," but yeah, that one was funny.
Yeah, it is really funny. It's just like rereading that, I was just like, I feel like I recognize more people in this book now. And it's like, Erica Henderson's husband is effectively in that book. And in my mind, he's a guy who says it's lit. And I believe Erica told me once that is absolutely not true.
He was very sad for that to be there.
Yeah, it's so weird. Comics, so influential. But before we get into your work, I want to talk about your background, because of all the people who have been on the podcast, maybe besides this writer named Torun Grunbeck, who is just an incredibly fascinating person, you have one of the most interesting backgrounds. To start with, your parents are both artists. Like, your mom was a violinist, and to very much simplify a complicated life, your dad was an opera singer at some point. That is an unusual background. I'm curious as to whether or not having an artistic family really played a big role in you kind of going down that path yourself.
Oh, it absolutely did. So it's in addition, so my dad, in addition to being an opera singer, so he stopped touring when I was about 2 or 3. He didn't want to be away from the family, but he started an opera company and he was largely in charge of the theatrical stuff for the college that he taught at. And was really involved in our city's local theater. And so I grew up in a very theatrical environment. I was backstage. I learned all the parts to everybody's stuff from the time I was, really little. And they always had art, but we had no grocery budget. We lived in very meager circumstances when I was little, but we always had tons of books. Like, all the money would be spent on books, probably to my mom's chagrin. We had lots of art books. We had a lot of comic strip collections from the time I was really little. My granddad was a big comic strip fan, so he had early Peanuts and Pogo collections and Asterix and things like that. And my dad would get his mitts on them. I had a Bern Hogarth Tarzan thing when I was little. I had a lot of comics that weren't comic books accessible to me. But the biggest thing is that I grew up in an environment where I saw how one does make a living as a self-employed in the arts, and the amount of hustle that requires, the sort of pervasiveness that it has with every facet of your life and your family's life. And so I came into it, I think, when it was something that I decided to do, with pretty clear eyes as to what expectations could be. And I also had a resource in my dad of, how do you handle tax stuff? How do you handle this and that? And, he was very free with his advice, which I was generally quite happy to take. And so it was a really helpful background for me so far as that goes.
I'm sure that to some degree, it also made you cognizant of the fact that some people wouldn't be coming to you with the best deals, and maybe you need to protect yourself from that.
Yeah. And I think that one of the things that my dad did was, he was a big proponent of self-publishing in whatever aspect that you're in. So for his, it was choral music publishing. So he started a music publisher initially for his own stuff, because he was unhappy with how royalty stuff worked for sheet music, and then ended up becoming a publisher for a lot of contemporary choral music composers. And a big part of that was just always wanting to have agency over your projects. And he did, when he would work on an opera, things like that. Like, he wanted to run the show. He would do he was a music director at a number of churches, and did it more or less on the condition that he would be managing the liturgy. He would be determining, like, what would be happening, which songs would be there for which liturgical season, and had a lot of control over how the services themselves play out. And so I've always had that same inclination, that desire to have as much control over the projects as possible, which is why I get real hung up on things like cover design, back matter, editorial stuff. And something that you've had Kyle Starks on here before, how much do you allow the publisher so far as giving them live text files versus you do all the edits and flatten them yourself? Like, I'm of the latter school, because I want as much control over the final project as possible. I want every shift, every change to pass through me, so that I can make sure that it's what's needed for the project. And that doesn't mean that you necessarily have to self-publish or create a publisher or something along those lines. It just means that you need to find a publisher with whom you have an understanding at the early stages or beforehand of what your individual roles are going to be in this collaboration and partnership.
Well, it's like you said, you got to go in with clear eyes. And it seems like it's also important to go in with intent and know that you need to establish the ground rules if you're going to get the things that you want as much as you possibly can. Because, a lot of people can't necessarily do that. So you just do your best.
Yeah. And just with anything else, there's trade-off. Like, the more I'm paid for a project, the less agency I feel I need over it, because they are buying my complicity as it goes along. And so there's some projects that I do that pay, freelance stuff that pays very well. And to those, I do whatever they want, and I'll offer my suggestions, and a lot of times they'll take my suggestions. But it's something where, if we came to counter purposes, I'm absolutely doing what they want. When it comes to a project that is born of my ideas, or that I'm looking towards making most of my financial thing on royalties or sales or something along those lines, like those, I tend to want a lot more control over the final aspect of it. So, there's always a balance with any of that kind of stuff.
I did want to briefly talk about comic strips, because those weren't just the first thing you read. It seems like those were like almost like a foundational influence to you, which makes sense, because I feel like your character acting has the liveliness of, I don't know, like one thing like I think people like forget about comic strips, mostly because like most of the time the average person engages with a comic strip is when they're a kid, and they don't really think about like the art form of it. But it's kind of a perfect form for telling a joke, and it's kind of the perfect form for doing little character work. And you have such exceptional character work throughout all of your projects. I guess, it was an early or those were early comics for you, but like how big of an influence were comic strips on you going forward as a comic book storyteller?
They're 85% of what my foundational stuff is, I'd say, or something in that range. I didn't read comic books like floppies or graphic novels or things along those lines, with rare exception, until I was in middle school. Even then, when I went out and bought something, it tended to be comic strip collections. I had about a 2 or 3 year run where I would read a lot of floppies, and then I fell out of them all at the same time, because early in ninth grade, I think, there was a gas station down the street from my high school, and a lot of, back then you could get the comics in the gas stations, and that's where I would get them. And up until that point, most of what I'd read was older. You'd go and you'd find, whatever X-Men comics you could find, or whatever this or whatever that. And so within about, I think it was the same month, there were 3 titles that I was picking up. There's the Joe Mad X-Men Gen 13 with Scott Campbell on it, and Timothy Zahn's Star Wars adaptation that Dark Horse was doing, that Olivia Vatine and Fred Blanchard were doing the art for. And the same month, the artistic teams changed on all of those.
Oh my God.
I think Joe Mad left to probably do Battle Chasers, got replaced by somebody else. Scott Campbell left Gen 13 art, and somebody else was doing that. And then I think Terry Dodson took over the second Zahn book. And there wasn't anything wrong with these artists, but I really gravitated towards the art of the original people. And the notion that an artist could change on a book really soured me, and I pretty much stopped reading floppies altogether until I was an adult, again, with rare exception. And but I did continue to pick up comic strips all the time. So like Calvin and Hobbes stopped at that point, but I was picking up Foxtrot a lot. Bill Amend is really foundational for my dialogue pacing, I think. And then I liked Zitz. I liked anything I could get my mitts on.
Oh yeah, when I was a kid, there wasn't a huge line. Well, that's not true. I was going to say there wasn't a huge line between what was good and what was less favored. To be honest, there really was. I love Calvin and Hobbes. I love Bloom County. I love there was like a hierarchy that formed in my head of the things that I really loved and what I didn't. But so you went to school at Murray State. Mm-hmm. Go Racers. It's funny. It's like they actually became pretty famous because of the NCAA tournament. And you studied theater and then English and then art. So it seemed like one way or another, your interest lied in the arts. Has that always been the case? And at that point, had you considered the idea of telling your own stories in comics? Or is it really like you were in I'm discovering what I want to do phase?
The thing with comics at that point is they're, at least in my experience, so, this is pre sort of the wider advent of chain bookstores. We had Walden Books at the mall, and I think that was about as much as you could hope for. I didn't really have a vocabulary or sense of reference for the types of comics that I could do. Basically up until that point, I'd had, or when I was in college, you had comic strip collections, you had the occasional miniseries that was collected, like Dark Knight Returns or something like that, and really not much beyond that. A run of X-Men, or usually older stuff, like Ditko Spider-Man, Marvel Masterworks books.
So this was like turn of the century. So this was before like Scholastic Graphics. This was before First Second. This is before the kids market really formalized. Somebody like Jeff Smith was famous for like self-publishing Bone, but it was this DIY good story of like great success, but it wasn't like I'm selling millions of copies Scholastic style. It was a much less formalized market.
Yeah, and I had picked up Bone. I really liked Bone. And it was one of the few it was actually the book that kept me going back to comic shops and made me stumble across other stuff that got me excited about things. But yeah, I didn't really, I thought, well, maybe I could do a comic strip. The idea of there being sort of self-contained graphic novels hadn't really clicked with me as a thing that could be done. And so so when I was at Murray, I knew I liked storytelling. So I co-founded the film club that still exists there, the filmmaking club. So they do a what do you call it, like a film festival every year and things along those lines. I was involved in plays at the theater in the Black Box, and I was on a show that was, on the local network and things along those lines. I worked for the newspaper. I had a comic strip. There were, I was always doing that kind of thing. I would write short stories and submit them to anthologies in prose. but I didn't really have any kind of sense as to a clear path for that. And I didn't find that until significantly later. And it was so I had graduated school. My wife and I were running a hotel in Mississippi. And I had a lot of time at the desk, so I was sort of running the desk and being the de facto concierge, and I stumbled across webcomics for the first time down there, and I started being active on a message board, and I cannot remember what the message board was. I want to say I can't even remember. I know, or I believe that the person who ran it passed away, and that it subsequently fell into disrepair. But a lot of the people on that message board were scholastic people. They were all roughly my age, maybe a couple years older. So I went to my first year of college was 99, 2000. And so I think a few of these folks were maybe 3 or 4 years older than me, but it was people like Raina and Mike Mayhack, and I think Joey Weiser was on there. A few SCAD people, Eleanor Davis, JP Coover. People would post their comics on there, and I read a comic that Raina did, which was a little 3-page story about her having read Barefoot Jen when she was in middle school, I think. And it was the first self-contained short story for comics that wasn't intentionally artsy that I'd read. Like, I'd gotten some Fantagraphic samplers at the library or something like that, but this was just a little standalone short story memoir type thing, and I'd never seen anything like that before. And in the note, she's like, I made this to go in one of my mini comics. And I thought, well, what's a mini comic? I bet it's a comic that you print on both sides of a sheet of paper and fold it over yourself and staple it, and then you have a comic in black and white. And so I went, and that day I did my first one. And so it's like a 6-page story about shaving my beard in stages. So it like starts off with, having a beard and then shaving it to a goatee, and then doing a little character thing, and shaving it to a mustache and doing a character bit in the mirror, and then eventually shaving down to nothing. And, the mouth is open. There's just 3 dots, and then sort of being sad and wandering off. And I posted it on, and I got, some nice comments from those folks. And that made me want to do another one. And that also is important because it was one of the first things that I'd ever done that I'd finished. Like a lot of times if I'd tried to write, I'd written short stories for class and things like that, but usually if I had an idea for a project, especially a comic, I would sort of roughly start in the middle, do a few pages, and then peter off. Like, I didn't really have a clear sense as to how to find something and complete it. Finishing something, like having this small story that finished and that read well, made me excited. And then I did another thing, and it was 10 pages. And then I did another thing, and it was 20 pages. And within about the space of about a month, I decided that this is what I wanted to do. And there were a lot of other contributing factors to that. I joined one of those get 6 books for free, and then you have to buy 3 more. And one of the books that I got was McLeod's Understanding Comics, which really was exciting. Barnes & Noble started to have, well, there was a Barnes & Noble about an hour and a half from the hotel, and so we would take trips up there. And they had a considerably expansive graphic novel section, and I started seeing stuff that were not sort of Big Two House style.
Sure.
I'd see like a Scott Chandler Northwest Passage or something like that, and realized that I could, this was more in the vein of the type of stuff that I wanted to do. I could work in my aesthetic, but have different, you weren't confined by genre. And so all these things kind of stumbled into place. And by the end of, I think like the first month of me being 25, I was like, well, this is where I want to go. Like, this is what I want to do, is to be a cartoonist. And so I sort of decided to pursue that wholeheartedly. And I was like, well, I don't know how to do this. I feel like I need to learn how to do this. And so I looked into different colleges that offered things. Center for Cartoon Studies hadn't started yet. That might have been where I would have ended up going had it existed, but they were still forming up and didn't start until the next year, I think. So I was basically looking between MCAD and SCAD, and we were really reluctant to move to Savannah because we'd just been in a tourism-centric antebellum town and wanted to do something different. And we were discussing this like while we were in the interstate as they were putting up the SCAD Atlanta sign. And so we saw that and thought, oh, well, there's a there's a SCAD Atlanta. So, and then like 2 days later, my wife got called out of the blue and offered a job in Atlanta. And so we thought, well, there we go. So we'll do that. And so we moved there with the expectation that I would get in, and I did, which I was really glad about. And so for the first year, I learned all the foundational stuff. Like it was a new program, the Atlanta campus. The faculty had almost complete agency over everything, curriculum, schedule, whatever they wanted to do. And they were great. It was Sean Crystal and Nolan Woodard and Pat Quinn. And there was about a 2-to-1 grad student teacher ratio, 1-to-1 my first year and then 2-to-1 my second year. And they, it quickly grew from that, but we had lots of individual attention. And I learned all the compositional things that I never really learned as an undergrad. I was a real newbie to comics. Like I knew I had internalized a lot of stuff from reading strips, but I didn't really know. I didn't have a vocabulary for any of it. I didn't really understand the mechanics of stuff. And I was also working very hard and not smart with the technical side of things. And so being taught how to not reinvent the wheel and how to do things more efficiently was huge for me. And so my first year was learning all that stuff. And then the second year was putting it into practice. I did my first book. I started working with Sean in preparation for taking a teaching position. He wanted me to teach there. I wanted to teach there. So I was helping out with a lot of classes and helping out with the events and all the student groups and things along those lines, and sort of taking a really proactive role in helping to try and shape this department that was in formation under the stewardship of these really great fellows.
I'm curious as to, like, you read that Raina comic and it kind of unlocked something a little bit for you. Was it more about seeing what comics were capable of, or was it more about seeing that there was a space that fit what you wanted to do in comics?
The latter, I think. And not even that I realized that I wanted to do it at the time. Like, it wasn't like I was sitting around pining thinking, oh, if only. Like, as a rule, and I'm, sometimes I'm better about this than others. Like, I tend to have a blind spot when it comes to potential. For the types of stories or the types of books or the types of, I guess, avenues for distributing said stories until I see it done. And then once I see it done, I think, oh, I could do something like that. Non-comics, I tend to be better about that. Like my wooden stuff, I think I come up with stuff that I haven't seen before. But comics-wise, like that, and especially when I was younger, it wasn't until I saw this that I realized that was what I wanted to do, were these short stories. And short stories that weren't necessarily genre specific. I tended to embrace and fall into genre stuff after I started doing comics. But for those first couple of years, I was, most of what I was reading was literary short fiction. Most of the stuff that I was watching tended to be sort of non-genre indie stuff, and which, is arguably its own genre. But seeing that kind of stuff had a market was really exciting, because there was an earnestness to it that had been lacking in the short stuff that I'd seen before. Like if you had looked at a lot of the sort of the Gen X cartoonists, Peter Bagg or Daniel Clowes or things like that, there tended to be, at least for me, a sense of detachment or, for lack of a better word, and this is an unkind word to use for the work, but there tended to be some snark to it. And I'm not a snarky person. I'm not a detached person. I tend to be very engaged and, in love with whatever it is that I'm enthusiastic about. And so seeing this branch of sort of very later Gen X or elder millennial comics that tended to skew a little more earnest and a little more, these are the things that I love, rather than the things that tend to bug me, which is what most of the short literary Gen X stuff that I'd read had seemed to be. And granted, my exposure was pretty limited. That felt a lot more in the vein of the type of stuff that I wanted to be creating.
And now, a quick word from one of our sponsors. Con season is among us, and the excitement can be felt on Zoop. July continues the fully funded Stardust, the Super Wizard anthology, featuring an all-star creator lineup including Mike Allred, Francesco Francavilla, Jeff Parker, Pete Woods, and more. The fully funded La Bornquena, Volume 1 hardcover from Edgardo Miranda Rodriguez, as well as new projects from Glenn Bray, Paul Allore, Stack Deck Press, Tripwire Magazine, and coming later this year, Howard Chaykin's first foray into crowdfunding. It takes less than 30 seconds to sign up, and the e-commerce style checkout is easy and intuitive. Add multiple rewards and add-ons into your cart, provide some info during checkout, and you're done. No confusing additional steps in finalizing your pledge, and no post-campaign surveys. And of course, the creators appreciate your support. For creators looking to crowdfund your project, Zoop is currently open for submissions. Email them at hello@wearezoop.com to start a campaign. And now, back to the show. I have to take us on a side because I think that this may not be a necessary part of the journey, but it's something I want to talk about. So I recently did a conversation with writer James Tynion IV, and we were talking about mental health and physical health and all this stuff like that. And he was talking about the importance for creators to have different inputs, like basically different life experiences to feed your work and everything like that. And one thing I think is extraordinarily fascinating about you, and this is not something that's hard to find. It's on your website. It's like in your about section. You list off the jobs you have had. And I'm going to quickly list them off because there are a lot of them. All right. You can take a break, Chris. Everyone listen.
Okay.
All right. Here's the jobs Chris has had. A college professor, hotel manager, a movie theater projectionist, a guard at a mental hospital, a martial arts instructor, a set builder, a church music leader, a process server, a life drawing model, a bartender, a car wash attendant, a bag boy, a delivery boy, a choir boy, lawn boy, a sixth grade social studies teacher, a janitor, a speakeasy proprietor, a process server, a video store clerk, a field hand, a deckhand, a puppeteer for children's television show, a muralist, a kickboxer, and a line worker at a pancake factory. That is a lot. I know you love comics best, so that's your focus. But I actually think that the diversity in experiences is important because it's like, I don't think you can, there are like kind of really two options. You can see that much of the world and you have that many jobs and you can become pretty jaded, or you can see that there's a lot of really interesting stuff happening with a lot of really interesting people there. It seems like you kind of went the latter route. I feel like those inputs were kind of important to you, even though there's probably no way you can really point to those and say, yes, being a church music leader led me on this path. Do you kind of feel like that's the case?
I think all of them. I think I can look to any of them and sort of argue for a specific influence that they had.
Sure.
On the comic sphere. I think that everything, and that's why discussions like these of foundation and how you got into comics and things like that tend to be a little bit difficult to do because I look at stuff holistically, and this is also part of why I like and gravitate towards history as a subject for sharing via comics. Is that I mentioned that Raina thing going to Barnes and Noble, but really there's 50 different moments that led me to doing comics and 50 different things that I read and saw. Those just tend to be the ones that have the most pronounced and immediate impact.
It's also not always just comics too. I mean, I think that people forget about that.
Yeah, and I think that most of my input and the stuff that informs my comics, I have that foundational stuff that's there, that's ingrained in my DNA. But the majority of my influence is not from comics. It's from novels, it's from film, it's from plays. A big part of it, honestly, is from commentary on those novels or films or plays based on either by the people who made them or by people who have studied them or things along those lines. Like the discussion of art tends to be as much an influence as the art itself, and I think always has been. But yeah, I think that I tend to look to a lot of different sources for comic stuff, and comics probably least of all. Even though there are things that only comics do that I love, and that's my favorite part of comics, is playing with the formal components on the page. Like how does the eye work through the page? How do you arrange the shot to contribute certain things to the reading experience? Especially how do sound effects and lettering integrate with the art in a way that does something new or fresh or exciting. I want to show off for my friends. The readers aren't probably going to notice it, but I want another cartoonist to send me a message and say, hey, I saw this and I liked this. So
I think a good example of that is in Six Sidekicks of Trigger Keaton. I'm going to probably misremember it because I again, foolishly reread Assassination last night instead of Six Sidekicks. But there's the sequence where there's like the main story going on, and then there's a fight scene going along the side of it. And do you remember the part I'm talking about?
Yeah.
And
I do. It took me a really long time.
You did, like, you were basically doing picture in picture from like a TV from the 90s. And it was two scenes playing out simultaneously. And that is not a formalistic standard in the repertoire of comics, but it was really cool and it worked really well.
Thank you very much.
And I think that's kind of like it seems like something you would be attracted to, is trying to find kind of a new way to tell comics in a way that excites readers and yourself at the same time.
Yeah, and that's the thing is, and I never want to do formalism for the sake of formalism. Like I always want it to be in service to the narrative and to the reading experience, and I never want it to, I do enjoy some work. Like I'm currently reading Leaves of Grass, and I'm having to go back and forth between the endnotes and the appendices and whatever else. There is some fun to that, but that's not a reading experience that a lot of people want. So I never want it to be something where the audience is having to work beyond simply the capacity of reading. So I think there are some elements that I'm drawn to that I would like to experiment with, but I tend to not do those because I don't think it fits the project. Like Matt Kent does that a lot with some of his stuff. And I think that but his projects are geared to that. They're about spies, or they're about these unseen things. And so having to unravel these different boxes in order to get to what the narrative is, I think makes better sense than something like Six Sidekicks or Mars Attacks. But I do think that there are ways to play with the page that show that comics are a different medium than anything else. They're not illustrated. They're not film on paper. They're their own thing, that have these conventions that you can play with these conventions, the grammar of comics, in a way that I think can be really exciting and really fun and create good compositions. I also really like that, when it comes to sound effects and lettering, they can make for a more interesting and stronger composition that does not require as much drawing work, because you get to draw around the lettering, which is also why I do all the lettering on the page. Like I don't over drop balloons. I tend to start with lettering first and then build the compositions around that.
One thing I think is really funny about sound effects is, like, when an artist does their own sound effects, it matches their own line so well that it almost, it is just art, right? You look at it and I look at yours and it feels like you, or I look at Erica's and it feels like Erica, or I look at, I don't know, Kyle's and it feels like Kyle's. And I think that's one of the funny things. There's an article I've always wanted to do, and I realize it's a population of one person, myself, who would be interested in reading it. It would be comparing an artist's line with their handwriting, because I feel like if you compared the two, that there would be a real overlap, because it's almost like inescapable. Like it's as signature as your fingerprint to an artist.
Yeah. And I think that's definitely the case with me. And I used to have really bad handwriting. And then after I started doing comics, I just would think, well, I'm drawing the letters. And as long as I'm drawing the letters, I can do a decent job. But, it requires a little more time. But I think you're onto something there. And there are certainly letterers that can and do, put a lot of effort into mimicking the line of the artist that they're lettering. And I think that the problem is, there are ways I think that digital lettering and lettering done by a letterer could be better integrated into comics, but it necessitates really jamming up the pipeline in a way that I think is problem for a lot of people. I think the ideal would be similar to what you used to do in the old, EC days, which would be, you have a script, you have the artist do rough pencils, then you send it to the letterer, they do that, then the artist goes back and pencils around the lettering. And I think that would contribute to a better overall product and a better overall page. But, that works better if everybody's in the same building. Like trying to coordinate schedules with that would be nigh on impossible, I think, on a lot of collaborative comics, especially ones that are, corporate ones where you're shifting through things or going through editors, etc. But I do think that tends to be the strongest means for it. And that's the way that I approach when I'm doing my own comics. I do roughs with essentially finished lettering. I send that to the editor. I beg editorial to do their edit pass at that stage rather than after the fact, because it's so much easier to change things then than it is when the finished art is done, and then you have to redraw balloons and whatever else. Yeah, the lettering tends to be an early stage for me, and I'd love to see it be an earlier stage in teen comics.
Yeah. Just to get into your work, you spent much of your career having kind of two tracks when it comes to the projects you take on, at least within comics. You also have your Schweizer craft stuff, which I find to be very charming. I was showing my wife the Black Cat Jug Band last night, and we were very much in love with it. But one of the tracks is your collaborations with Kyle Starks, which we're going to get to. But the other one is your middle grade-ish graphic novels for publishers like Oni for a Second and Abrams. I say middle grade-ish because it's like sometimes the line is like maybe a little bit more young adult, maybe a bit more young reader. I don't know. There's a line there, but
I'll consider. I think of them as middle grade largely.
Okay. Why did that end up being a space you reside in the middle grade? Is that more about opportunities presented to you, or is it more about that's what you pursued because it kind of fit what you were looking for out of comics?
Probably more the latter. That's less a sidetrack. Like, it has become a smaller part of my output, but I still think of that as my primary job. Like, I still think middle grade graphic novel as my main thing, even when I tend to do it less frequently and when it brings in less money than some of my other things. But that's because I loved reading comics when I was a kid, and I want to make comics that kids will love. Honestly, that's the main reason for it. There were and are publishing opportunities for it, and that's great. And I'm in a position now where I have other opportunities in the direct market, but that still tends to be the thing that I enjoy the most doing, like coming up with the story, drawing everything, like having a complete hand over everything is a real joy, even though it's not necessarily my best work. Like, I think that the stuff that I do with Kyle and I we both want to do the best that we can. We often have very different ideas as to what constitutes the best that we can. And we have very different priorities. And Kyle, the way I look at it is that, and I've said this before, is that Kyle, when he approaches a story, he starts with the heart and finds the structure. And when I do a story, I start with the structure and try to find the heart. And I'm not as good at finding the heart as Kyle is by a long shot. And so I think that there are places with our collaborations, especially, where I will try in the execution to put as many weeds in as possible, because I say it from the standpoint of I get lost in the weeds, but I think the weeds are important. And Kyle will stay on the sidewalk, and sometimes you miss the weeds entirely. And so I try to pepper his sidewalk with as many weeds. This is a terrible analogy, but maybe it makes sense.
I'm going to continue this analogy. What's an example of Kyle bringing out a weed whacker and pulling it back, and you bringing Kyle over and saying, hey, it's pretty cool over here too? Like, are there any examples from your collaboration you can point to?
A lot of it tends to be detail stuff. Like, there's I don't ever want there to be a thing where the audience says, but wait, what about X? And so Kyle will be like, that doesn't matter. That is not important for the story. And I'm like, but if it's going to trip somebody up, it tripped me up when I was reading the script. And so we'll argue about that. And he'll make acquiescences, and I'll make acquiescences to things that I think are a little too on the nose. Like, there's a good example with, not of something that I influenced, but of a thing. So there's a scene in Karate Prom, which I was coloring for him, where one of the characters tries to kill the other character, or another character, very casually. And it's not something that I ever would have attempted. And he's sort of coming up with it as he goes and figuring out, well, what is going to make this person seem like a really terrifying villain? And he will just jump right into things that I will hesitate with, because I'll have 15 different questions of, well, if I do this, how does that complicate things? How does that, what does this say about the character? What are the logistics of this? And he'll just do it and figure out the logistics afterwards, if that makes any sense. And I think that his stories are a lot stronger for that. They have a ton of heart, they have a ton of oomph. And I try to learn from that. And I try to look at that and say, okay, well, where am I deviating from my elevator pitch? Where am I deviating from sort of my basic foundational character drives? But a lot of it tends to be trying to downplay where I think, like, some examples would be, so when we sent off the first 6 Sidekick script, we got a note back from the editor that was like, this, so a lot of this seems kind of silly, like the way that the characters are behaving. And Kyle was like, this is a comic. And I was like, Kyle, I understand exactly what he means, because I feel the exact same way reading the script. And so I wrote back to the editor and I was like, here's the thing. Basically, whenever Kyle is doing something that feels broad, I'm going to play that back as much as possible and treat that as naturalistically as possible. And it'll balance out the humor. It'll make it to where it doesn't feel silly. And then the areas where things are very balanced back, like those are the places where I'm going to push the acting and push the things along those lines and try to find this balance. And I think that's one of the things where our two sensibilities kind of meet, because on his, and my favorite of Kyle's books are the ones that he writes and draws himself, and he disagrees with this, but Rock Candy Mountain, Old Head is probably my favorite of his, although Karate Prom's a close second. I think those are really strong, and I think they're strong because Kyle is doing things that I, in theory, hate, and he does them really well. Like, I'm not a comedy guy. Like, I think that I'm not a funny person. I think I can pace a joke well. I can't come up with a good joke. But when it comes to like watching comedies, I also want them to exist really strongly in whatever other genre they're being. Like, the story needs to be solid, the cinematography needs to be solid, the acting needs to be solid, etc. And it bugs me when they're not. And so, like, comedy alone won't do it for me. And Kyle's a lot more permissive with that. He's like, is its job to be funny? Did it deliver? It's fine. So I think me generally not liking comedy makes me more critical of how the books that we work on together read. Like, are they going to read like, yeah, there's funny in them. Does it work without the funny?
Yeah. I mean, to use another analogy, it's like, I think you ground Kyle and Kyle pulls you up to where he is. And not to make it seem like you're in the mud or something like that.
No, I'm in the mud, David. That's okay. It's okay to say that.
It's interesting, though, because it's like, I appreciate both halves. And I think that's part of the reason why your guys' collaborations are as special as they are. Like, I really love the backup comic explaining how you two work together on Mars Attacks. That's fantastic. And I like, there's little details in there that you express, like how Spencer is the main character of Mars Attacks. And you explain that until a certain point of the story, you only see his top teeth. And then at the end, you can see his bottom teeth because it's a sign of like evolution and about how he's changed and all this stuff.
Well, yeah,
like that.
Because his dad, you only see his bottom teeth.
Exactly.
And so it's a shit. Yeah. And that's just it's little things like that. But that's,
But I mean, like, that's the thing, though, is like, it seems like you as a storyteller really want to focus on how stories work and how these things can be executed as well as possible. And Kyle's like, let's just have fun, man. Let's just go crazy.
And that doesn't mean that he's not great at execution, but execution is Kyle's the least important facet for him. Like, his is, what is the content and how do I most effectively deliver that? And for me, the content is secondary to execution. And that, of course, has a limited lifespan in terms of readability. That means one good read and you think, wow, I really enjoyed this from a technical standpoint, and then you forget all about it. Whereas Kyle stick with you. And so I'm trying to learn from him and be more heart-centric with it. But yeah, we went and watched Asteroid City the other day, and we left and I was like, okay, so, and I was talking about the lighting and how there's a specific effect that looks similar to the way that Spielberg's last two movies have looked like. And he thanked him in the credits. And I'm like, did he tell him how he did that lighting? Like, how was that done? I'd never seen anything like that before the last 3 years. And Kyle's like, why are you talking about the lighting, man? Like, how is that a thing? Like, are you ever going to make a movie? Do you care? No. Like, what about the story? And I was like, story is what it is. Like, what am I taking away from this? I'm taking away from the aesthetic. And that doesn't mean that storytelling isn't important for me. And most of our discussions do center around story, either when we're working on our own projects and we're asking for feedback from each other, or when we have read or watched something and are offering our critiques to each other and why did or didn't this work. They tend to be story centric, but the execution is where I put most of my thought and energy, I think.
I think it's funny. I've only now come to this realization. So Mars Attacks and Six Sidekicks of Trigger Keaton fundamentally, conceptually feel more like Kyle books. And I say that with respect. They're both of you guys, but you know what I'm saying. But then there's also projects you've taken on, like the Roanoke book that I mentioned in the intro, but also Maker Comics Fix a Car that you did for a second. There's only so many different ways you can gussy up a comic that is about fixing a car and how to do that. But I think the thing that's interesting about it, and it kind of ties back into all your jobs, is it seems to me that one of the things you're best at as a storyteller is, all right, I have this problem I have to solve. I have to figure out a way to turn this thing that is fundamentally silly into something that hits and feels real. Or I have to figure out how to tell this comic that is about fixing a car, which is, I'm going to be honest, boring
A
as hell
boring subject.
conceptually.
No, yeah, absolutely.
And you have to turn that into a narrative. It seems like you're almost like a comic mechanic. You're like the person who gets in there and you're like, I'm going to figure out how to make this work. I'm going to get that lighting right like Steven Spielberg. I'm going to make that beat hit. And you're also very good at story, but it seems like your brain is very much attuned to figuring out the mechanics and the right way to execute this stuff in a way that will ensure that it hits as well as humanly possible.
I'd agree with that. Like that tends to be my main focus and what I like, what I enjoy doing most. And it's that's one of the reasons why I like working with Kyle when we're not on our specific things, but sort of as you know, he's mentioned, you know, virtual studio mates where, you know, because I think that my strength tends to be in making things better more than it is in making things. And so that is one of the things why I like working with him as a writer, is that I can take this stuff and sink my teeth in. But when I'm working with myself, it's at the points where I'm like, well, how do I make this better, that I tend to most enjoy and most shine, which is usually the laying out stuff on the page. But yeah, that the problem solving is the fun part for me. And the problem solving on the page more than the problem solving in the writing stage is fine, but when I'm putting stuff to paper, like that's when I get excited.
And now, a quick word from one of our sponsors. It's Bad Idea, and Bad Idea is, once again, doing something? They're telling you that only you can save digital comics from Amazon, as the Renegade publisher is kickstarting a new digital comic from David and Maria Lapham, Scorpio Steele, Bill Crabtree, and Dave Sharp called The Ends. They're describing it as a quote-unquote comic book masterpiece, with the whole endeavor even coming with a pro edition featuring work from other creators. Wait, Bad Idea is doing digital? I thought that wasn't their thing. You might be wondering. You were correct. But apparently, you are no longer so. The Ends is coming to Kickstarter, but also digital at some point in the future. Sounds like a bad idea. It also sounds like Bad Idea. We'll see what it entails when it hits, but Bad Idea, doing its thing on Kickstarter once again. And now, back to the show. This is a random thing I want to bring up, but one thing that I really... Have you watched... I'm going to make an assumption the answer is yes, but have you watched Edgar Wright and Simon Pegg and Nick Frost movies together? Like
I don't know that we've ever watched them together, but we've we've all...
No. I mean, sorry, have you watched those? Have you watched those 3 movies?
Oh, yeah, I've watched them.
I think it's funny. Like, you guys are accidentally building in a little connective point that's like, because that trilogy, those 3 movies that they did are called the Cornetto trilogy, because all 3 movies have a cornetto in it, which is a British ice cream treat. The first 2 books you've done together, Mars Attacks and Six Sidekicks, each have a scene where somebody's running to a car while being extremely harried while shouting something repeatedly. In Mars Attacks...
I did not realize that.
Yeah, Spencer says, "Oh God, oh God, oh God." And then I can't remember the name of the driver. Is it Kit? Is it Kit? No,
Skippy.
Skippy. When Skippy's running, he's like, shit.
Yeah.
I feel like whatever you guys do together next, you got to have a scene where a character is running to a car while stressed out and repeatedly saying something, because that will be your connective tissue. It'll be like
I'll keep it in mind, Dave. and I do look forward to working with Kyle again on something, because I think he's an incredible writer. It's just, you know, both of us have bandwidth issues. We have a lot of projects we're wanting to do. We have a lot of projects we're wanting to get done, and there's only so much time to make things.
Is part of the reason why you color his books sometimes, because you colored Rock Candy Mountain and you colored Old Head and you are coloring Karate Prom, is part of the reason why you do that just so you can have like that kind of connective tissue with Kyle?
No, it's in that instance, it's because those really are some of my absolute favorite books. Kyle is one of my very favorite cartoonists. I think his stuff is spectacular, and I want it to look as good as possible, and I want it to read as strongly as possible. And I feel like and this is of course extremely egotistical, but I feel like I'm going to do a better job helping to make that the case than somebody who's not as invested in those books. And so I go through and, you know, that's the main reason. I have a real love for Kyle and a love for those books, and I want to help shepherd them into the world. And that doesn't mean that there aren't other colorists who might do a better job than me, but Kyle's aesthetic, and less so now, but with Rock Candy Mountain especially, was very similar to the way that I was drawing a few years earlier, like when I was doing Krogan stuff. And so it's very easy for me to look and see what he's trying to do and what he's wanting to highlight and focus and bring to the forefront and work with that. And, and we have different ideas as to what constitutes good color stuff. Like he wants a more naturalistic palette, I think, than sometimes I'm willing to provide. Like I want each scene to have its own palette. I want you to be able to flip through the book and know, okay, this is this scene, this is this scene, this is this scene, these are these characters. And so we'll sometimes argue on that stuff, but he will, and I'll make allowances, but he'll usually defer to me, because I think with the first issue of Rock Candy Mountain, he micromanaged it a little bit more, and then was the least happy with the colors on that one. And he's like, once I let you do the other things, I liked it a lot more. But that's hard. Like, and I understand that. Like, I won't let anybody else touch anything that I do. So I imagine it takes a lot of effort for him to relinquish control over that and put that in my camp, because it certainly would with me.
Have you drawn or colored anything for any other writer?
No, I've written for other artists. I haven't drawn anything for anybody else, and I haven't colored anybody else. Like, I don't want colorist work, and I don't really want to do artwork very much. I might do something with Matt Kent down the road. I'd probably do something with Kyle again. Generally speaking, though, like, I can always write my own things. And so if I'm working with somebody else, it's because I really enjoy their I do a regular job for Scholastic that the classroom magazine staff writes, and so they do that, but that's less sort of traditional comics. I don't know that I count that, but no, generally speaking, if I'm working with other people, I'm working with them as a writer, and the drawing I tend to save for myself.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. It seems to me that, like, I've asked Kyle about, like, would he ever draw something that somebody else wrote? And he's like, no. He looks at himself as a writer who also occasionally does his own books that he writes and draws. Yeah. And I think that that's a common feel for, like, people who are kind of working in your space. It's like, I guess he probably has. It's like Matt. I don't know if Matt Kent has drawn a lot of books that others have written.
I think very few. He did one that Cullen did for Oni, and that's pretty much it. I think he had a co-writer for his first two Mephisto books with Top Shelf, but I think he was also, it was a co-writer. He was also helping to craft that story himself. So
it seems like it's very important to have, like, in collaboration. If you're going to work with somebody, you, Chris, as the artist, you want to know that it's somebody who's you trust, and you have that friendship with, and you have that connection with, to the point where it's not just going to be like, you are the guy who draws and you draw what I say. It's a collaboration about story.
Yeah. And that's been what's been nicest with Kyle, is that there have been places where, like, story-wise, he's like, I want my don't change my dialogue. I can argue with him about dialogue, but if I change it on the page, he gets real mad, and justifiably so. Like, I can pace it the way that I want, like, and then when it's not dialogue, I can do. He's like, he'll have beats that are important. He's like, I need this to happen in this fight scene. At some point, Skippy bursts in with the car. At some point, this needs to happen. But he lets me do all the mechanics of what else is in that fight scene, like what's happening, where are the characters when they're saying things, what are the characters. He'll have the beats and the moments that are important to hit, but he'll give me the freedom for everything else, the car chase, whatever else. So anytime there's an action heavy sequence, he gives me my druthers on that, and that is something that I really appreciate. And if I weren't doing it that way, I don't think I would want to do the comic.
No, that makes sense.
Because that's that problem-solving part. Like, that's that thing where I'm like, how can I do this the best that I possibly can do? You need a degree of agency in order to do it that way.
Absolutely. The last thing I want to say about your work overall, I think, and granted, I only just read it. The funny thing is, I bought Mars Attacks from you and Kyle at New York Comic Con 2019. And the funny thing about it is I only just recently read it because I was talking to Kyle and I realized I'm an idiot and I hadn't read that somehow. And I got off my shelf. I actually, and I don't know if this is an unpopular opinion, I feel like it sort of is, just because Mars Attacks, I think some people ignore it because it's just like, oh, it's just a weird license book that I'm not going to pay attention to. But I feel like Six Sidekicks of Trick or Treatin' is a very great comic, and I think that it's been recognized as such. I think Mars Attacks is as good as it. I think that you guys did a heck of a job with it, and it's such a quintessential combination or collaboration between you two because Spencer and Major's story is very heartfelt. It has a really great narrative to it. I was so invested in the cast. Like the further we go along, it helped that there was a dog, as there always is in a Kyle book. But at the same time, you guys really just like nailed that. And it's funny. Like my only real experience with Mars Attacks is the Tim Burton movie.
Yeah.
And I loved it. And I don't know. I just want to say good job by you. And also everyone should read Mars Attacks because it's a really good book.
Well, thank you so much. That one, we really enjoyed doing that one. And I think Kyle had mentioned it on your show before where he was like, I got asked if I wanted to do Mars Attacks and here's my idea for it. And I was like, "Ooh, that's good. Tell him I'll draw it." I was like, "That's not how it works." And then he told them, and they were like, "Oh yeah, well that's perfect." And so he's like, "Ted, go." He gets real mad when I stumble into things in ways that they're not supposed to be done, because it constantly justifies my rural idiocy. Basically, I jaywalk through the industry, and he gets the same way I do through the streets, and he's not a fan. But that was an instance where we got to do that. There was a really tight turnaround on that one, and so the first issue I had to do everything because I was also doing another book on top of it that had a deadline, but they wanted it to come out in October, and so I think the first issue I did, drawing, letters, colors, everything in 2 weeks, and the second issue I had 12 days. It was cramped.
You killed it. You can't see that in there. I mean, to be honest, it's just, I don't know. I mean, it is kind of funny looking at it now, and I'm not saying this is why Kyle wrote it like that. It kind of feels like it helped that both of the first two issues were in very kind of concise spaces. Like the first issue is basically mostly in a senior citizen's home, a retirement home, and then the second issue is basically like in your backyard with your family members, like in like a tiny town where a militia is taken over and is protecting themselves very poorly from the alien invasion, and that tight space maybe. Like it's kind of like the idea when an entire season of a TV show takes place on like a farm or something like that, and you're just like, I feel like you're doing this because you really want to save budget.
I don't think, no, he did that intentionally as a means of expanding the scope of the story. So the first one is in one building, second one is on one street, third one is in one town, fourth one is in like one cityscape. So it's like, so he wanted to expand the scale with each successive chapter. It just happened to benefit me in the sense of having a closed space with limited time in which to do it. It also helped that you only had two leads throughout. Like the hardest thing about Six Sidekicks is that you hardly had a single page that didn't have
six
characters on it. And so that really, that complicated. It's nothing compared to Assassination. I can't imagine how Erica had to deal with the cast of Assassination. Yeah, Jiminy Christmas. But that did help. But those are elements where we'll discuss that stuff back and forth, and we'll discuss that stuff back and forth on the projects that I'm writing and he's not working on, and that he's writing and I'm not working on, where we'll find different aspects and we'll be like, oh, well, you can build on this thematically. And I think that in that instance, that expanding the scope of the characters range with each chapter was a real fun, punchy bit as we went along. And I did really enjoy that one. That one had a little less space to play. Like Six Sidekicks I really enjoyed because, with the exception of one issue, and it was one that I had the one that I had the most frustration with was the one with, I think it was issue 4 where they go into the lot, maybe issue 3.
Oh, the one where the one with the fight sequence I mentioned earlier.
I think it's the one with the fight sequence, and the fight sequence was in there basically to give me a chance to play around because there wasn't really anywhere else to play. And so that one took a really long time for a variety of reasons. The other issues went quickly. That one was a headache, and that happens. But Mars Attacks didn't really have much of any play spaces. Like, it was pretty tightly mapped out just because of the amount of stuff that we're trying to compress into these issues. And also from a foundational standpoint, using the cards as the basis. So we both got a set of the original 50s Mars Attacks cards, and the structure of the narrative was the order number of the cards. So like if you like card number 6 happens in the comic before card number 8, before card number 15, etc. And so, having all those structural things that we were building around, there wasn't as much room for the formalist stuff. But that also meant that it went quicker because I wasn't like constantly trying to figure out how to have a good time on each page.
I do think it's interesting though, because like one thing I've talked to a lot of artists and cartoonists about, really just everybody, is that sometimes constraints are interesting too.
Yeah.
And that's not to say that you want to be in a box all the time, but it's like, I actually think that box kind of served Mars Attacks well, in the sense that it is very tight and it's very focused, and it really kind of just centers on that relationship between Spencer and Major, and that's part of the reason why it hits as hard as it does. And it hits as hard as it does is not a phrase that I often use when describing Mars Attacks stories. No offense, Tim Burton. I love.
No, it's fine. It was he did such a great job, like instilling
It's wonderful. It's insane.
the heart and energy and enthusiasm into that book, and that was a real treat to work on with him.
Last question for you. I wanted to ask about one thing I think is really interesting about you is you have your books, your graphic novels, the middle grade stuff that you really focus on, and all the stuff you're always kind of building. You have your Kyle books, you have your Scholastic stuff or other books you write for other people. You have your prints, which are exceptional. And then you also do your Schweitzer craft stuff, which I think is really fascinating. You have like your Santas, and you have the Black Cat Jug Band, and they're like little stand-ups that go up on like stages, and they're kind of dioramas, and they're really cool. It seems like one of the things for you is that while you want to make this work as a career, you also want to embrace yourself as a storyteller and as a creator and as a cartoonist. I guess my question is what do you want comics to be for you? Is your focus mostly on being happy doing your thing, whatever that means?
I think so, because I used to fret a lot about legacy and, well, what books am I leaving? Are they going to be of interest to anybody? And the thing is, like, really, there's no way to have any control over that. The ephemerality of publishing is, I think, would be a real gut punch to any of us who think about it. You look back at people who, who was the bestseller in 1975 or whatever. Does anybody still read that person's books? Probably not. Who knows? Maybe it's James Michener or something. And so, and the farther back you go, the more is that, like, we've got a very short shelf life. And so thinking about things from that standpoint, I think it can be a fool's errand, like trying to chase that.
I think it'd also be harmful to you as a person and as a creator, because it's like, if you're trying to chase a legacy, it's fundamentally not really up to you in some ways, right?
Yeah. And you also, the other thing is, you never know which of your projects is going to catch with readers. If you have one that is a book that everybody knows and that everybody's read, like, you are head and shoulders over everybody. That's so rare. I think Kyle's going to be much more likely to have that than I am. I think that within certain circles, that Sex Castle, but he still hasn't had that, that big, what's Kyle's book? But the thing that's interesting about Kyle is that when he has that, everybody, the book that defines him, what's his Huckleberry Finn, what's his Sherlock Holmes, whatever else, it's going to be in keeping with the rest of his stuff, because he has such a very specific voice. And even when he jumps from one genre to another, they have such crossover in terms of content and voice and execution, that if you like one Kyle thing, you're going to like every Kyle thing. The thing that's sort of tricky about my own output is that it's so wildly disparate from one project to another. I'll do try to be pretty grounded historical fiction thing, and then I'll do a wacky kids fighting monsters thing, and then I'll do nonfiction, and then I'll do a mystery, and then I'll do whatever else. And now I want to do a fantasy book, but I also want to do like a geared towards adult horror thing. And it's so the chance of having an oeuvre that anybody responds to in its whole is pretty slim. And so, yeah, so that's a long way of saying, yes, what am I most interested in doing right now? And how do I pursue that? One of the reasons why I'm doing the Schweitzer craft stuff is that I think scratches my legacy itch, especially by doing seasonal stuff. I'm making things that people are going to bring out every holiday for as long as they have them. And that's where I get to be a part of people's lives from an artistic standpoint, more so than my books. The books are, hopefully they're going to be a good read, but if I have a legacy thing, it's going to be these little knickknacks that people, give to their grandkids one day if they haven't fallen apart.
Well, I think everything you do is lovely, Chris, but that is all I have for you. Thank you so much for coming on to talk about your very eclectic career, your life in comics, Kyle Starks, and everything else. I appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you so very much for having me on, David. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Off Panel with cartoonist Chris Schweizer. You can find him on his website and social media at Schweitzer Comics and his work in the Six Sidekicks of Trigger Keaton, Mars Attacks, and more. Big thanks to Deanna Chapman for editing this podcast. If it sounds better than usual, it's because of her. Love Off Panel, want to support it? Subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts today and give the show a rating or review while you're at it, but 5 stars only. You can also support the show by backing it on Patreon. Find the show at patreon.com/offpanel. And when you back it on there, you get early access to each week's podcast, as well as weekly content and more. Want even more? Subscribe to my subscription comic site, Sketched, at sketch.com for long-form articles, interviews, and the rest of the site's content. You can find Off Panel and Sketched on social media by following on Twitter and Instagram at SketchComic, or following me at @SliceFriedGold. Big thanks to all my existing patrons, including Christina Merkler, Andrew Lehman, Cancel Comics, Scott Place, Darcy Van Polges, Kevin Bides, Travis Schmeiser, Tom Evans, Natalie Mockery, Reed Beeman, Kelly Sudconic, Max Wood, Jeremy Lambert, Brian, Matteo Ciccati, Chris Doré, Nir Levy, Dennis Hoffman, Jason Hussa, Kieran Gillen, Jonathan Kent Uratam, Henry Johnson, Jingo Boren, James Tynan IV, Chris Langford, Jason Wood, Tom Peachy, Ben Damstead, Rom V, Nick Walker, Patrick Coyle, Isaac Oren, Scott Carpenter, Rent Norb Studios Comics, Capes and Tights Podcast, Klaus Van de Ven, Brian Subman Industries, Jack Mulqueen, Kyle, Carl Kerschel, Robert Masellic, Elza Chartier, Luke Nakashoji, Dr. Luke, Scott Hazelwood, Canadian by Proxy, Bradley Rader, Carl Choi, Brandon DePillis, Patrick Brower, Declan Shalvey, Dan Garino, Adam Freeman, Ben Wild, Brian Klein Q, Nick Bennett, Birdcage Comics Cafe, Susanna Polo, Reed Hinkley Barnes, Mario Tiambank, Andrew Carita, Matt Mahoney, Stephen Hall, Philip Myrick, Chris Bachala, Torin Grunbeck, Fuzz Bubbles, Christopher Todd, Transmitter Down, Waltz Comics and Books, Akil Wilson, Alex Dimitriopoulos, Terry Dodson, Wesley Giff, Sean Kirkham, Julia Anta, Brett A. Schmidt, Jason Goodmanson, Paul Reinwan, Vita Ayala, Akil, Philip Seavey, Al Ewing, Ryan Alcock, David Kelly, Nick Polito, Matthew Groom, Jason Massey, Adam Bogart, Matthew Taylor, Nick Patera, Jacob Sorelli, Ford Gilmore, David Baraldi, Nick Hall, Bjorn Basin, John Hendricks, Steve Anderson, Ian Maxwell, Cliff Chang, Carl McMahon, Scott McGovern, Nathan Fairbairn, Adam Highfield, Fiona Stables, Mark Abnett, Michael Shirley, Tom Barnett, Jim Demonakos, Norbert, Nick Lowe, James Kaplan, and Mission Comics and Art in San Francisco. You guys are all the best. A quick thanks to Wolfpack for letting me use their song Outro as the show's opening theme, and to Upright T-Rex Music, who wrote and performed Off Panel's outro and add music just for the show. Check out their music on Spotify because it's completely delightful. Thanks for listening, and tune in next week for another episode.